You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
That's right. Sons of the Shoe is back. Spencer German with you, and excited for the latest episode of the show as we get you ready for this weekend's matchup against the Purdue Boilermakers in Columbus. Not quite as daunting as a task when that game is being played in Columbus versus when it's being played in Purdue. You know, that place can be a tough place to play sometimes, especially if it's a night game. You don't want. We've seen Ohio State get upset there before during the Urban Meyer era, so feel much better about this game being at home. But regardless, Purdue is a bad team anyway, so Ohio State should win this one. We'll talk about all those things. Hi, how are you? How's it going? Appreciate you guys jumping on in. I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, review, subscribe to the podcast, Sons of the Shoe, wherever it is you might get your podcast. Apple, Spotify, the Odyssey app, the 92 Through the Fan YouTube channel, where you can see my ugly mug there and get involved in the show via the comments section, whatever you so choose. Did I mention Apple? I'm mentioning it again. Thank you guys for all your support, as always. We are in the process, by the way. If you couldn't tell, I know the intro still says Nick Wilson. He is no longer doing this podcast with me, which, yes, I know. Let's get the crocodile tears out. We will miss Nick dearly. I say crocodile tears. That was kind of rude. I listen, I did enjoy hosting the show with Nick, and he's a phenomenal colleague, a phenomenal friend. He just he gets pulled in a number of different directions, and it was kind of becoming too cumbersome for him. As you guys could tell, like there was nights where we were getting ready to do post game and he just wasn't available or wasn't ready. And so it's nice to just kind of be able to keep it going. And I'm excited about that. And we're in the process of working on adding a new co-host to the show that I think you guys will be excited about. But definitely, you know, we carry on without Nick because I think that this show is worth it. I think that you guys, the fans, enjoy it. And I want to continue to have the Ohio State part of like the Ohio State conversation with each and every single one of you every single week and every single weekend after these games go, because I'm an emotional Ohio State fan and I like expressing those emotions and sharing those emotions with you in real time and being able to talk about these things. So very much looking forward to the new era of the podcast. But in the meantime, you just get me, and we are going to dive nose deep into a preview of this matchup against Purdue, the next game in Ohio State's path as they march their way towards the college football playoff. The rankings for the first time, the college football playoff rankings were unveiled this week, which we will obviously talk about as well, and where Ohio State ended up and where they sort of ended up in the actual bracket. And I have some interesting thoughts on that I want to get into. But before we get there, I do want to start with our preview, as we tend to do. And we go through a host of different topics here to sort of break this one down and dive into it a little bit deeper. And first and foremost, we start with the upset scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is this game, you think, to be an upset? That's basically what the upset scale is all about. And I'll be honest, guys, if this game was at Purdue, I'd probably say, like, I don't know, maybe a 4. Like, because this Purdue team is just overall not very good, as reflected in the spread, which we will get to. But the fact that it's a road game, maybe would have been at night, I would have felt a little bit of pressure about that because Ohio State's lost in that building before. But with it being a home game, a ho-hum noon game in Columbus at the Shoe, and Ohio State coming off of an emotional win, I feel pretty confident in saying, like, I'm not worried about Purdue at all. Ohio State should win this game running away. And that's understanding that this Ohio State team has been susceptible at times to stumbles. They almost did it against Nebraska a couple weeks ago. The difference is Nebraska actually has some players on that team. And we had talked about the defensive line leading into that one and the fact that they were a pretty big physical group. And they were able to stop the Ohio State run game and really kind of dominate the line of scrimmage in that way. I'm not as worried about that with this Purdue team. They're not a very good team at stopping the run. They're a worse team at stopping the pass. I think they're like 123 in terms of passing yards allowed per game. They're 117 in terms of rushing yards allowed per game. So their defense is just not very good. Ohio State, like, this should be sort of a a palate cleanser of a game for Ohio State to sort of reset the table before they get into well, and then they got Northwestern obviously the week after that, which that game, as we know, being played at Wrigley Field, which would be fun. But we can talk about that next week. But like, yeah, this should be sort of a palate cleanser from the Penn State win, and just a chance to kind of get yourself right and feel what it's like to dominate a team again and build some confidence before you get ready for the obviously next big showdown on your schedule, which is Indiana, which is also the game before you play Michigan, as you know, which is going to be a massive, massive deal later this month. So yeah, like I'm just not. Purdue is always a team that you think about being known for the upset. But in this iteration of Purdue's team, I just don't think this team is very good. And I'm not worried in the slightest about this Purdue team. So I'm putting it out of 1. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's in the cards for Purdue this year. As much as they can make games fun and interesting at times, I don't think it's happening here in 2024. That brings us to the next phase of our preview, which is names to know. And I want to start actually with wide receiver CJ Smith, who made his debut for Purdue last weekend and was instantly, and I mean instantly, a go-to target for Hudson Card, their starting quarterback. He caught 4 passes for 55 yards in that game last week. And it was a really solid debut for him. So despite the fact that there's like 8 receivers ahead of him in terms of like yards this season, including Max Clare, who's their top guy with 462 yards and 2 touchdowns. And there's a number of guys who have 2 touchdowns. That's the team high in terms of receiving touchdowns. I actually like CJ Smith kind of presents an interesting, different threat and look than what Purdue's kind of shown throughout the season, because he just got added into the mix here for the Boilermakers. So I am certainly keeping an eye on him. I think you should also be aware of their sort of running back group that they have. And it's 3 different guys have gotten a decent amount of snaps, but 2 guys really kind of headline it in Devin Maccabee and Reggie Love III. Maccabee has 562 yards rushing so far this season, 5.9 per carry. He has 3 touchdowns. Love has 5.4 yards per carry, 339 in the season, 2 touchdowns. And they sort of utilize those guys in different ways and at different times. And they give you different looks that Ohio State has to be ready for. Coming off of the game they just played this past week against Penn State, rather, I feel pretty confident like this defense is finding its stride at the perfect time. And I hope they can continue that. But dominating this team's run game is going to take them completely out of the equation, because I just don't trust Hudson Card to be this elite level passer and like beat you in that way. And the secondary I thought played well last week as well. And Purdue, other than CJ Smith, who I think, like I said, poses kind of a different threat than what most teams have seen this year from Purdue, just because he's the new kid sort of getting mixed in. I still think Ohio State has the horses to keep this team largely off the scoreboard and really dominate the secondary as well. So that's kind of where my head's at with that. I think Purdue averages like a respectable 134 yards per game on the ground. That's part of, I think, the reason why I think you have to at least pay attention to it. It's one of their better areas. And when I say better, it still is only like 84th in the country in terms of rushing yards per game overall. So it's not like they're like, blowing people out of the water, had this amazing run game, but it's a threat and it's something to be aware of, especially as we talk about dominating in the trenches. If Ohio State can do that and take away Purdue's run game, they basically have like no shot in this one. The only player on the defensive side I want to highlight for Purdue, because he might actually be their like highest graded draft prospect for 2025, is Kydron Jenkins, who is just a phenomenal player. Last year, he finished with 57 tackles, 15 and a half for a loss, 7.5 sacks, and he earned all Big Ten honorable mention by the coaches and the media for his efforts in terms of the performance that he gave. This year, so far this season, he has racked up a grand total of 58 tackles, so even more than he had last year. He has 5.5 sacks total, and he has 8.5 tackles for loss. He is a force, man. Like, he runs around, makes a lot of plays. He comes on blitzes. He gets to the quarterback. He is the guy that I think kind of anchors their defense and the guy that you have to be the most aware of. I do think Yanni Karloftis is a name to sort of know on the defensive side of the ball too. He can bring some pressure. And there's some others who have racked up the sacks. Will Helt is one of those guys. He has 7.5 sacks, so right behind Jenkins. But Jenkins is the name to know, and sort of the captain, the quarterback of that defense, and a real threat to mess up a game plan if you aren't aware of where he is. So that's the one name I want to throw out there on the defensive side because, like I said, he might be Purdue's highest graded player in terms of guys that are going to be going to the draft next year and have the chance to be drafted off this Purdue team. Key matchup. I'm going to go Will Howard against Purdue's secondary. Purdue's last among Big Ten in total defense this year. So they're out of 18 teams, they're 18th. They're 16th out of the 18 teams in pass defense. So just overall, like I said, none of their defensive numbers are really that impressive. None of their defensive numbers are really that good. Ohio State has okay. We've talked so much about the NIL era and the leveling of the playing field that's kind of gone on around college football this year. I think we've seen that play out with some of these teams in both the Big Ten and other conferences where teams are playing you a lot closer sometimes. And it's not just like boat racing everybody because you have more talent. But this is a game where more talent should win. This is a game where Ohio State should just be able to out-talent Purdue to an easy victory and kind of coast if things go your way. Because, I just don't see this Purdue defense as giving you much resistance. And so my key matchup, like I said, is Will Howard against the Purdue secondary because of how poor that secondary has been. The pass defense for Purdue has been. Will Howard has a chance to really light them up, I think, especially with the receivers he has, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka. You guys all know the names. Like, this could be – and it's funny because I want to see them establish the run after the way they ended that Penn State game with the 11 plays of just straight running the football, 58 yards to close out the clock. You had like 5 minutes left, and they milked the entire clock. Penn State never saw the ball again. I want to see them build upon that and make the run part of this game. I want to see them establish that physicality early on in this one. But I think that also does that, and that will open things up for Will Howard to throw the ball downfield a little bit more. And we know they're going to always work the pass game a little bit. But I think along the lines of trying to establish the run, I also think after a game where Will Howard didn't play his best, to get his confidence level back up a little bit after or in this Purdue game and sort of set the tone for what awaits you. Yes, Northwestern, but as you know, Indiana and then Michigan. I think this can be a big game for him to kind of get himself feeling good again after, some blunders in that Penn State game that ultimately didn't cost you, but still resulted in you not maybe playing your best game overall. So I'm saying Will Howard in the Purdue secondary, but I do think it's going to be important for Ohio State to continue building upon what they did this past game against to end that Penn State game and prove that they can be the more physical team and honestly, and just like get more reps and see more tape and more concepts of what this offensive line, this makeshift offensive line with Donovan Jackson kicked out and Carson Hinsman as the left guard, what they can kind of bring to the table and what they can do for you in games where, especially as you get ready for games that matter even more here down the stretch. Next up, we go to our educated wish, which is basically just like, what do you want to see out of this Ohio State team? And I kind of alluded to this already, but in a sport that is the margins are closing and teams are becoming more and more, more competitive in terms of the wealth is being spread around because of NIL, the talent's being spread around. You have an Ohio State team that should just be able to strictly out-talent their way past Purdue. Purdue's a good team. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I take that back. Purdue is not a very good team. Ohio State is a good team. They have the talent, and I understand, like, again, because teams are able to sort of keep pace with some of these bigger the programs like the Ohio States of the world, because they sometimes have more competitive rosters and they can keep guys longer, and I helps those things. Purdue is not in a place where that should be the case. Like, this should be a convincing win for the Buckeyes. They should be able to run away with this one, and if they don't, then I might have some concerns in the post-game show in terms of, like, how they were able to come away with a win in this one if it's too close. I'm not envisioning that. I think they will blow out Purdue, but it should be a convincing win in this instance because Purdue just isn't quite there yet. Like they're a program is sort of in rebuild and in transition, and this is still one of those like old school style matchups where you're like, okay, one team is clearly much more talented here, and that should win the day when you get onto a football field on Saturday for 3.5, 4 hours. And then lastly, we go to the odds, which are brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Ohio State favored in this one expectedly, as we talk about the talent discrepancy there. 37.5 points. They are favored. That is a massive, massive spread. I'm going to say they don't cover the spread only because I feel like Ohio State has sort of stumbled of late and been a little bit sloppy at times, but you can still give me a convincing win and win by like 30 and it feel like they won convincingly. So I'm going to say they get to maybe like 45 points or so. Maybe Purdue gets like 10. And although even that would be surprising given how well the defense has played, I don't know. Maybe they'll get like a garbage time touchdown. And that's the big factor here is like if they call off the dogs at some point and Purdue scores late, I think that maybe closes the gap on you covering the spread. But I do think Ohio State, rightfully so, being favored by 37.5 is fair. And again, going back to my educated wish, I'm expecting that they win by at least 30 points. Maybe that's my educated wish is win by 30 points to convince me that it was a convincing win for you against a team that you should have no problems with whatsoever. All right, guys, that is our preview of the Ohio State-Purdue matchup. Give me your thoughts on what your upset scale is, your educated wish, and if you are taking the Buckeyes to cover the 37.5 points that are being laid against Purdue this weekend. You can let me know in the YouTube comments at the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel, or of course on Twitter at Spencito_. When we get back, after a quick word from our sponsors, the first iteration of the College Football Playoff has been unveiled. Did they get it right? And is Ohio State ending up as a lower seed actually a good thing for the Buckeyes? We'll talk about all that coming up here on Sons of the Shoe. Welcome back into Sons of the Shoe. Spencer German with you here on the podcast as we continue talking Ohio State, Purdue, getting ready for the weekend. And we now know the first iteration. It came out on Tuesday night, as you guys are well aware, of the College Football Playoff ranking. Ohio State coming in as the number 2. And this is the kind of the confusing thing here. Ohio State came in as the number 2 ranked team in the country based off the College Football Playoff rankings. But because of the nature of the playoff and the fact that the conference winners get the buys in the bracket, they are the 5th seed in the bracket if the playoff started today. Now, there's an interesting conversation I want to get into about that specifically. But I guess the first part of this is it sort of revolves around the idea of whether or not the committee got this thing right in terms of where everybody sort of fell in the nature of the ranking here. And I actually do think I think the top 5 is totally valid. Oregon has the best win in the country over Ohio State. Other than maybe, well, actually, it's not as strong of a win anymore for Vanderbilt after Bama's now lost 2 games. But yeah, they have the best win in the country with Ohio State coming in at 2. They're undefeated. They deserve to be 1. I think you could have interchanged Ohio State or Georgia as 2 or 3. Georgia's, I think, still Georgia, even though they've had some close calls and even a loss on their schedule to Alabama. But Ohio State obviously has the one loss by 1 point on the road to Oregon. So I think it's fair to have them up there in the conversation. I think Georgia's 3 or 2 would have been fine. And I do think Miami is 4 makes a lot of sense. They're undefeated. They continue to just blow teams out because that offense with Cam Ward is amazing. And I think Texas at 5 makes a ton of sense. Now, 6 through 10 is where you can have some discrepancies maybe and have some conversations. I know there was a lot made of Penn State being 6, despite their strength of schedule, and the idea that they now have a loss to Ohio State versus like a Tennessee team that, like Tennessee has one loss as well, and it's obviously it's their season is still very much in their sort of own destiny here. Like they're able to kind of control things the rest of the way in terms of where they end up and what they're able to do. They're going to have a shot at being in the playoff, of course. And yeah, like I understand where the SEC being the conference that the SEC is makes this an interesting sort of conversation because there's going to be, I think, at least 3. I think there's going to probably be 4 teams from the SEC that get into the playoff when it's all said and done. We know there's kind of an SEC bias that exists, but even beyond that, like they do continue to prove that they are a very strong conference, and so it's fair that they would be part of that conversation. And fair that you would maybe have 3 to maybe 4 teams get in. I just think too, like, I don't know. The interesting part here is, again, if you talk about strength of schedule, that Penn State ended up where they did, given that they do have one loss and maybe their strength of schedule isn't as good as some of these other teams. I also think people were upset that they were higher than Indiana, who's undefeated, but Indiana's strength of schedule isn't really much to write home about either. So I don't know. Like I think I always say this, and it makes for fun fodder to sit here and talk about the rankings every single week. I don't know that we have to make such a big deal out of the rankings, especially the first iteration of them, because a lot of this stuff is going to sort itself out. Georgia and Tennessee, they still play each other. Miami might end up running the table to win the ACC, but they're going to have some potential bumps in the road along the way because they might have to play Clemson, who still is ranked in the top 25. They're going to have or they're going to have to play if Clemson finds a way back into the title game. That is, SMU is kind of the team that they are likely to play right now, and maybe SMU gives them some trouble. So there's still some pathways here for things to kind of play itself out. Ohio State and Oregon are probably going to. Well, I should knock on wood here. If Ohio State runs the table, they will likely see Oregon again in the Big Ten championship game, and then that'll decide who gets the bye versus who doesn't. So like, there's so much that's still going to sort itself out. I can understand where people are maybe upset by certain things, and you're sort of setting the bar for certain teams, like Penn State being 6. Maybe that sets them a little too high to start as they work their way back through to see how high they can get by the end of the season, because their schedule the rest of the way is pretty easy. Maybe that's setting and giving them an unfair advantage over other teams that weren't given the same grace, other than the fact of like what the brand is. But I don't know. Like I didn't have any major gripes with this. Alabama was the only 2-loss team that was featured in the top 12, and that largely is kind of hanging on by the idea that they obviously beat Georgia. They're the one team at this point that has beaten the number 3 team in the country per the committee. And so they get the benefit of the doubt there, and they get a spot, and they're also obviously a big brand. The other part of this, though, too, is like, even with Bama, some things could still sort themselves out because they still play LSU. They still play Oklahoma, who I don't think is a major threat to them. And they still play Auburn, who we know, I mean, just last year, Auburn almost upset Alabama and kept them out of and they would have kept them out of the playoff last year. So there's still a lot of things that can kind of unfold here. If Bama loses a third game, I mean, that LSU Bama game is basically a playoff game, because LSU at this point is a 2-loss team, 1 loss in the SEC. And if you lose a third game, I don't think you're getting in even as an SEC team. So again, some of these things will sort themselves out. We'll just have to see how it kind of goes. But the other interesting part of this, because like I said, the ranking itself is different than the bracket. And that's the key thing to remember here. Is like Ohio State is 2, But if it started today, they would be the 5 seed in the bracket. And as the 5 seed, this is the road that they would have in the playoff as things stand right now. 12 seed Boise State would be your first matchup. And then you would play 4 seed BYU if you win that game going to BYU. No, actually, that's we're all still learning. I think those games actually might be, I'm going to look this up, games that are like actual bowl games. So I'm going to double check that. And I'm sure all of you are going to be correcting me in real time on this because I'm an idiot and I didn't. Yeah. So those games would all be, the quarterfinal games are all actual bowl games. So it's your Fiesta Bowl, your Peach Bowl, your Sugar Bowl, your Rose Bowl games are those. And those are the ones that are played, like one of them is on New Year's Eve and then the other 3 are on New Year's Day. And then you get 2 more of those games in the playoff semifinal and then your national championship if you're able to advance that far. So what's interesting about this, though, is like you look at this path for Ohio State and it's like Boise State and BYU, sign me up for that. And so there is a valid question in this of like, is it actually better for Ohio State not to win the Big Ten championship if they were to meet Oregon again and take like an easier path potentially to the semifinals to better your chances of advancing on through? I understand where that theory is coming from, and it's a fascinating one. I want to remind people, though, like, I don't think you should just, like, if this is how it shakes out, and what's interesting is it's more than likely that the number 12 seed is going to be your highest ranked non-power 4, power 5, whatever we're calling it now, conference winner. So Boise is in the driver's seat for that if they can keep on winning in there in the Mountain West. But that doesn't mean like it could change at some point. Maybe it would be an even easier path. And so there is a good chance that if you're the 5 seed, you're going to be playing like Boise State or somebody that's a non-power 5 in that first matchup. And generally I would say like, okay, I get why that would be appealing, but that Boise State team is no slouch, man. Like they pushed Oregon to the limit. And Oregon actually almost lost the game to them because if you go back and watch, like there was a kickoff return or a punt return and the returner like dropped it right near the goal line. And they actually thought that he might have dropped it before the goal line and it never got reviewed or anything. They said it was good and they let it be, but man, was it close. And so I don't know that you should just be like, in the name of trying to like manipulate the standings and manipulate the bracket to end up as the 5 seed. I don't know that you should just be like banking on that to try to get Boise State or draw Boise State in the first round. So you think you have an easier path because then you got to go through BYU as your next team out of the Big 12. I understand the thought process there, but when you play that game, man, it can be risky on top of the fact that you'd rather have the bye. You'd rather have a week off to get your team healthy, get your team right, start game planning for whatever matchup you're going to have after that, and have one less game to sort of risk injury and all these different things. We just saw a couple weeks ago the Buckeyes lose Josh Simmons, and how important that has been to this team this year, and that loss has been to this team and a detriment it's been. Like you don't want to risk more injuries in a game just because you think it might be the easier path. And there's also the idea that like if Ohio State runs the table, gets the Big Ten championship game, could you theoretically like rest guys and be like, yeah, we're just going to get the 5 seed and then try to play Boise State? I guess, but there's no guarantee that the committee like rewards you for that either if you get a second loss to Oregon. Like that could drop you down the standings depending on how some of these other teams finish, and you might not actually end up with a more advantageous matchup. Like there's no guarantee of that based on how the committee is going to sort of decide these things and do these things. So I think the goal here should be and has to be you try to win the Big Ten, get the bye week, and you let the chips kind of fall where they may. Now, again, that could be a less advantageous matchup if you draw like that matchup would be Indiana or Tennessee versus Oregon, the way things sort of set up right now. And maybe Indiana is not a daunting matchup if you beat them the first time around here coming up in a couple weeks. But again, like a team like Tennessee out of the SEC, they could give you some fits, as could some other SEC teams. So there's still so much to play out. But I am not subscribing to the idea that the Buckeyes should try to get the 5 seed because you're almost guaranteed to play the top ranked non-power 5 winner. I think it's just too much of a risky thing to try to manipulate, and it could backfire on you in a big way. Aside from the fact that Boise State team, if that's who you end up playing, is certainly not a team that you want to take lightly or that anybody should be taking lightly because they're really, really good. And Ashton Jeanty is incredible. Do you think the Buckeyes should try to manipulate their way to the 5 seed rather than win the conference and get the bye week, or should they be going all in to get that bye and get rested and get a skip around of the playoffs so that they don't have to, so they can play one less game? Your thoughts on that at Spencito_, and of course at the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel if you want to get involved in the show. We take one more break, and when we get back, it is another rousing rendition of 4 Down Territory. We will do it next here on Sons of the Shoe. I would hope if I muted my mic. Final segment of Sons of the Shoe here this week as we get you ready for the showdown with Purdue on Saturday, 12 o'clock kickoff at the Shoe. And this final segment, we always dedicate it to a couple different things. First, our Michigan Panic Meter, which I'll just throw it up here real quick. It's not moving. After last week, the win over Penn State made me feel confident again in this team. The way they finished that game in particular made me feel confident in this team again. And if they can play like that, if they can out physical Michigan, shouldn't be a problem. I'm not, and again, I've said this before. The only thing that I think about going into that game isn't so much like Michigan's going to do something crazy and win, because I don't think that Michigan team is very good right now. They lost a lot of talent from their national championship run. It's more so worrying about what Ohio State's going to do in terms of shooting themselves in the foot, and that's the thing that looms large, I think, even going into that game. But right now, I feel pretty good about their chances not to ruin things or do the stupid things that will cost them a game, because they surprised me in a couple of different ways with that win over Penn State, most notably that last drive. So I feel pretty good about things right now. I'm in the very, very dark gray, no panic on my end. But as we continue moving here, we go to 4 Down Territory, and first down is going to take us back to last weekend, where James Franklin, head coach of Penn State, feeling the heat after a loss to the Ohio State Buckeyes yet again, got into a little bit of an exchange with a fan walking off the field. Here is how that went.
No, you're going to be man enough to call. What's your name?
I don't think we have to watch the rest. It's just him walking away. But that video for courtesy of Cody Duncan, who shared it on social media, basically, if you couldn't hear it, told the kid, hey, or he asked the kid, what's your name? If you're man enough to talk, what's your name? I mean, listen, I don't, people were saying this was like such a bad look for James Franklin. It wasn't like he like jumped into the stands and tried to like fight the guy or anything. He was just asking for his name. It seemed like I don't know. Maybe he was trying to have like a respectful conversation with him. He was going to be like, listen, Bill, or whatever the hell the kid's name was. That's a terrible guess of that kid's name. I don't think it was Bill. I don't really have a problem that he like asked what his name was specifically. I also think it's within the kid's right just to walk away and be like, nope, I'm out of here. See ya. And not answer the question. I thought that was comical. I mean, is it the greatest look to be ranting with the fans or berating or getting into it with fans? Probably not. I mean, Nick Sirianni at the NFL level got called out for this a couple weeks ago when he was like cheering in the face of the fans who were like booing him and calling for his job. And I understand where there's frustrations there for James Franklin. I guess, I don't know. You guys are going to call me like too lenient on this. And maybe that's how you feel about my stance on Ryan Day to this point up until recently. I just don't know like what the expectation is supposed to be at Penn State. Like, I think that they're supposed to be I guess to me, like the expectation at Penn State is like you beat Ohio State once every couple years, like 5 years, maybe once every 5 years. And so in that regard, like, yeah, maybe he's failed and it's time to like talk about his job security and if he should be the coach long-term for this team. But he did sign an extension, like 3 years ago for like 10 years. So I don't think he's going anywhere anyway. And that's the thing. He signed that extension back then a couple years ago without having beaten Ohio State in like 5 years prior to that. So clearly the school, clearly the athletic department, like they are on board with this guy being the coach and understanding that Ohio State's his bugaboo. That's that by signing into a 10-year contract, you kind of accept the terms of that. And so in the grand scheme of things, like given what Penn State dealt with the Jerry Sandusky situation and that whole scandal, I think he has Penn State back to a point of relevance and back to a point where they're contenders for the playoff. The expansion of the playoff is going to make them a playoff team pretty much every year. I think the standard at Penn State is lower than Ohio State. I get that maybe every couple of years you want to have a shot at the championship, and maybe you hit on the right recruiting class, and that opens up that door for you. But like I'm not trying to be lenient here because I think we do have similar. The situation is similar to how we feel about Ryan Day here in Columbus and in Ohio, but like I just don't know like how much more some of those people want, other than I guess being able to beat Ohio State every couple of years, which if that's the standard, then I guess I can understand it. And fans are certainly within their right to call for his job. But I do think by and large, like Penn State has kind of reached what their standard and what their level of a program is supposed to be sort of asking for here. That brings us to second down, which speaking of head coaches on the hot seat, Florida announcing on the day we record this episode that they are sticking it out with Billy Napier. This got me wondering because people have talked so much about Billy Napier this year as being a guy who is on the hot seat, along with like Hugh Freeze at Auburn. Obviously, we know the Ryan Day conversations and there's others, but like I wonder if we are entering an era where because we're seeing so many coaches like run from college football, Nick Saban most notably this past year, if we're entering an era where teams and programs are just going to be less willing to move on from coaches that like because of the payouts. I mean, I think Billy Napier still do like $26 million or something like that. They would avoid his contract right now. And I don't think they want to pay that. Especially with, just the economy of college athletics and college in general today. There's not as much money as there used to be, like to throw around and buy out a coach and pay those types of things. And these deals are getting bigger and bigger than ever. But also just because like the expansion of the playoff, you give a coach maybe a little longer leash to see things through and see what they can do on that stage now that there's more opportunities. I also just think like NIL allows your team to get good like almost the next year immediately. And I do think on some level, to go back to what I was saying at the top of this conversation, like with so many coaches like fleeing the sport, I wonder if teams are just or schools are more nervous about like, well, okay, maybe we don't think this guy's totally the guy, but who are we going to get to replace him? And I think that's part of the conversation with Ryan Day here at Ohio State is like he's done so much well, and it's just the big things that he hasn't done great to this point. And I get why the standard is the standard at a place like Ohio State where you want more. But I understand I understand like on some level, Nick's argument that we played last week where he's like, you're what are you going to get to replace him that is going to be better? And Ohio State has the luxury of like, they've rarely had any sort of drop off. It's always been like coach to the next coach, to the next coach, to the next coach. And they've continued kind of and picked up where they've left off every single time, it seems. And on some, like, I just think like programs are going to be more willing to like, hey, if you're getting us to that stage, and somebody like Ryan Day is a perfect example of this, at some point we know you're going to break through. Like the more chances you get to get there, the more likely you are at some point to get to the mountaintop that we're hoping that you reach. And so they're going to have a little bit more grace with these coaches. And I think that's kind of what's going on at Florida here is all of those different things kind of compounding. The money aspect of it, the fact that the playoff is expanded and it's easier to be in that conversation, the NIL changing how quickly you can be good, and just the fact of like, okay, if you move on from him, who are you getting? Who's that next coach that comes in and is going to be resoundingly better? And I think that it's kind of a weird spot for college football to be in terms of the head coaching cycles, but I think that it certainly exists. All right, we got two more topics here. Third down, it is a playoff topic, and we got two playoff topics to kind of end the show here. And the first one is, which first round matchup, based on how things are set up right now, is the most intriguing to you? And you guys can answer this question again in the 92.3 The Fan YouTube channel comment section, or hit me up on Twitter at Spencito_. I'm going to go with, though, like that Penn State Notre Dame game as the 10-7 matchup. That is just about as like appealing as it gets in terms of like an old school football matchup. And I understand like a lot of people are probably going to say Bama, Texas. We've already seen that this year, though. Notre Dame being an independent doesn't play a lot of these other teams that are going to be in the playoff this year. And so because of that, like an old school of like two classic programs like Penn State, Notre Dame, sign me up for that 10 times out of 10. To me, that was the one that stood out as like, I'd be really excited to watch that game unfold between those two teams. A Notre Dame, a team that we think should join the Big Ten at some point, but they've kept their independence from now, or for now. But yeah, that's the one that stood out to me. But if you pick Bama, Texas, I think that's pretty valid, even though we've seen those two teams play already this year. And then fourth down, another playoff related topic. Which team in the playoff right now will be out of the playoff by season's end? Ooh, I love this question because, man, if Indiana loses to Ohio State, there's still a chance that I think they get in as a one-loss Big Ten team, because you know the Big Ten and the SEC are going to sort of get some preferential treatment here. BYU is interesting because they are the front runners to win their conference in the Big 12 right now, and they don't really play anybody of significance the rest of the way. They have Utah, who can always maybe be a spoiler team this weekend, Kansas, Arizona State, and Houston. Those are all games I think that they should probably win. But I guess like it feels like the team that's maybe closest to missing would be BYU, because I don't know that the Big 12 is getting like the benefit of the doubt of getting multiple teams in. And so if they lose one and Iowa State sneaks back in, or if Iowa State were to like upset them in the conference championship game, or even Colorado, who's very much still in the mix here with just one loss in the conference, two losses overall, one loss in the conference. I don't know that BYU is, I guess if BYU lost to Colorado and Colorado wasn't ranked high enough, like, although I don't know, like if they win the conference, they get a bye, so they'd be in. So yeah, I guess the answer is BYU, because they seem like the team that's most likely to like slip up somewhere along the way that you maybe don't trust the most. But I also think Bama is in play here, because Bama could very easily lose to LSU, and that would be, like I said, a 3-loss Bama team. Even though it's Bama, they ain't getting in, which is why, like I said, this Alabama-LSU game this weekend is massively important for both those teams, because it is essentially like a pseudo playoff game for each of them to decide if one of them has a shot at getting in as a 2-loss team, or one of them is, on the outside looking in as a 3-loss team, and you're kind of on to 2025. So I think it's those two. Notre Dame has an easy schedule. They should win out the rest of the way, and they'll be in because they're Notre Dame and they're ranked right now. So why wouldn't they be otherwise? I think Miami, even if they lose in their conference championship, probably still gets in. I think Georgia's safe unless they somehow lose 2 games, and I guess that could happen. It's not like they've looked completely dominant at times. I still trust Georgia probably the most of any of these teams in the top 5, top 10 to win it, just because it's Georgia. But like they still have a tough schedule. They play Ole Miss this weekend, Tennessee the weekend after that. Like there's still some room for them to potentially stumble, but I just don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I think my answer has to be BYU, because the Big 12 isn't this dominant conference. And if they lose one game and then lose the conference championship game, they're out. And then my other answer, I think, would be Bama, because they have a chance to potentially be a 3-loss team, even out of the SEC. I don't think that's going to be good enough. Which team in the College Football Playoff right now, so that the teams that are ranked 1 through 12 that show up on that bracket that we talked about, do you think has the best chance of maybe missing the playoff by season end? And what first-round matchup do you find the most intriguing of the way the bracket sort of set up to this point? You can answer those questions with the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel, and of course on Twitter at Spencito_. As always, I implore you to like, follow, subscribe, and review the podcast Sons of the Shoe wherever you get your podcasts: Apple, Spotify, the Odyssey app, the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel, which I feel like I mentioned 30,000 times during this episode. Did I mention Apple? I might have, but I mentioned it again. Appreciate you guys, as always, for jumping on in. I will be back with a post-game recap edition of the podcast when the game goes final against Purdue. And we will talk about everything that kind of unfolded and break it all down with you with the next episode of Sons of the Shoe. Until then, enjoy the rest of your week. And as always, go Bucks.